When I come into services on the breeze of the last minute, or the shirt tail shoot, that's what Mr. Armstrong used to call them. When he would plan a trip and they were still in Eugene, and the church was still there in Eugene, Oregon, there was a big train station. Well, it's a little train station by most counts, but it was a few blocks from where they lived or from the little office that the church had at the time. And when he was ready to take a trip to go cross country to negotiate for another radio station or travel down to Pasadena before he was down there full time, he would leave at the very last minute to get to the train station, to catch the train to get down there. And sometimes Garner Ted or Richard David would be driving, and they would take the car on two wheels around corners to get him into the train station at times. He called that a shirt tail shoot. And Mrs. Armstrong hated him. She wanted him to plan ahead. Until one time, it was 1956, they were getting ready to go on an international trip. At that time, they were, Ambassador was already operating down in Pasadena. And so this is where her shirt tail shoot took place. They were going to go overseas and look at a possible site for a campus in Switzerland, is where they were thinking. Ended up being in England when they did find one a few years later. But at the last minute, she decided to go, and so she had her own shirt tail shoot, throwing stuff into the suitcase as fast as she could in the last minute, going to, I don't know if it was a train station, because they had to go clear across country from California to catch a steamer out of New York City. So the shirt tail shoot, we get to do a lot of those in the ministry. Enough of that. The purpose of the shirt tail shoot. The sign-up list for trumpets is on the table now. I have that on two good authorities, and so we don't have to wait for the sign-up list to be up there. It is up there. Okay, did you notice that we are having economic problems in the world today? I was going over some notes of a sermon that I gave about 8 years ago. And guess what? That was 2008, and we were right in the middle of the economic crash that took place then. The housing boom popped, or the housing boom fizzled, or misfired at least. And now we're getting all kinds of troubling reports coming out in the Wall Street Journal and various other financial papers and things about funny things being done in the stock markets. China is borrowing like crazy. I mean, at a prodigious billions upon billions of dollars rates. All kinds of other danger signs. We see there was one, as I read this as well, there were 6 of the major agribusiness companies. Of all things, Bayer Aspirin is one of them. Go figure. But Monsanto was in the mix, and all the others. And they're all in a little horse race right now, jockeying around as to who's going to eat the other one. In other words, they're going to merge. And we'll come up with either 2 or possibly 3 out of the 6. They'll still be the full size, but instead it'll be more power consolidated in fewer hands. That doesn't bode well for America when you have the rich getting stupendously rich to where they have too much power. We haven't learned to manage our economy very well. In the Bible, we have ancient Babylon conquered the house of Judah long after, 100 and some years after the Syrians conquered the northern Israelites. And the Jews had to go to Babylon. And so Babylon, because the writers of the Bible were Jewish, and all the ones that came after that, Babylon was not a good word. It was a bad word. In Jeremiah, in chapter 51 and 52 of Jeremiah, or is it chapter 50 and 51? You'll have to check, but it's right there. He takes Babylon apart. That was his time, you see. The Jews were in captivity. He's the one that gave the prophecy that they'd be there for 70 years before they would come back. He was there when Jerusalem fell. I mean, he was in Jerusalem in prison in the courtyard of one of the courtyards of the palace. I don't know if that was when he was down in the pit, but he was imprisoned in the palace itself when the Babylonians broke through and sacked Jerusalem. And so he wrote about the end of Babylon. That theme was picked up by Ezekiel, who was contemporary with Jeremiah, and maybe a little bit after Jeremiah for a time, because Jeremiah, after the fall of Babylon and his trip down to Egypt, because of the remaining scattered Jews that left in the country, all decided they needed to go there, and God said, don't go, you'll die. And they all went and they died, except for Jeremiah and the king's daughters and Baruch. And they got out of that place, and they went to Spain, and they went to Ireland. But Babylon was a bad word. Ultimately, by the time of the book of Revelation, John was talking about Babylon, and Babylon was viewed as Rome by John's time. When Peter's epistle, he spoke of the brethren in Babylon, and some people say, well, he was referring to Rome as well, but he wasn't. That was going to be 30 years later, because Peter and Paul died very close to each other, 67 or 68 A.D. John finished writing the book of Revelation about 100 A.D. when he died. So, but Rome became Babylon. The Roman Empire became the modern Babylon. When you go back then to Jeremiah and you start looking at it, you realize that Jeremiah uses language that is more applicable to the world, as we say it, the whole world. The world's system of economy and system of nationhood and all the other systems that it have, religion, education, and so on, it's all Babylon. And in our time, we're talking about the world system when we refer to the Babylonish system. That is the world, the way the world does things. That's the present evil world's environment and economy. But you stop and think about this. What will the economy, and I can use the word, there are two meanings of the word economy. I have 3/4 in my pocket. If I had a 4th quarter, I'd have a hole. But we only have 3/4. So if you go out and spend that on something, I don't know anything you can buy for 75 cents anymore that's significant. That's part of the economy, the financial economy. But the word economy is, if you back up another layer, is actually used to refer to the whole society. How the society functions, how people communicate with each other, how they interact. Financially interacting, the buying and selling of food and goods and things is just a part of the greater economy in that sense. So what would the economy and the societal broader sense of the millennium look like? The environment and the economy of the millennium. That's what we're going to look at today. This is a pout sermon. A pout sermon because I love to speak about the millennial age. But this year at the feast, my assignments are the opening night sermon, which is sort of just a brief introduction to the millennium, and then the last great day. I love preaching about the last great day. So it's a fascinating subject, and it gets more fascinating every time you dig into the scriptures and you think about it and analyze it. But so I was pouting to myself that I didn't get to give a millennial sermon. So I thought, well, I'll just give one today. And then you get your appetite whetted maybe a little bit more for what you'll be hearing at the Feast of Tabernacles. And gets us geared into thinking of what will it be like? You know, the wonderful world tomorrow, what will it be like? You have to read and analyze and transpose God's way forward into an age that He is running. Christ is the King of kings and Lord of lords. And the saints now resurrected, meaning us and our spiritual ancestors going way back, will be ruling under Him. We'll be implementing these changes and guiding people through them. So we've got a vested interest in knowing something about this. Let's think about the economy or the environment. You have the environment, then you have the economy. But the environment affects the economy quite a lot. Just randomly, we'll pick rain in due season. Since we had rain this week, started complaining about how dry it was in Massillon, and then it dumped on us the other night. So we did get rain in due season. Ohio needs a lot of rain. It's really kind of great. It self-irrigates, but it needs 3/4 of an inch to an inch a year just to keep up with the vegetation growth that the state has and the reforestation that's going on. And then, of course, the crops are a week, thank you. And it needs a lot of it, but God sends the rain through here, and typically Ohio gets rain in due season. You know, this is a blessed agricultural ground. We used to have a friend out west that said if any other nation had a square mile of the black earth of the richest fields in Ohio, they'd make a national monument out of it. And the way we run our farms in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, we wash it down into the Ohio River and out the Mississippi, or straight into the Mississippi and out the Mississippi. Wash it out into the Mississippi Delta, down by New Orleans. We don't treat and value the things that God has given us nearly enough. Ezekiel 34, though. Let's just look at a couple of prophecies that sort of spark our thinking about the environmental dynamics in the world tomorrow. Ezekiel 34, and we'll look about, well, we'll start with the animals. Verse 25, we always like this. This is the zoo prophecy. I will make a covenant of peace with them, meaning Israel, and cause the wild beasts to cease from the land, and they will dwell safely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods. So you can go camping, and you don't have to worry about grizzly bears wanting to bite you while you're sleeping, or snakes sneaking into your bedroll and biting you. You know, they might sneak into your bedroll. That's lively enough. But if they're not poisonous, it doesn't really matter if they bite you, does it? Probably matters to most people. They freak out when a snake gets anywhere near them. I used to be that way when I was small, too, and then we had so many rattlesnakes we had to deal with. We kind of get inured to it, and you just deal with them. And I will make them and the places around the hill a blessing, and I will cause showers to come down in their seasons. So you have rain in due season. One of the other, when you find that passage of rain in due season is a blessing God would give Israel when they were obedient to him. And here it will be for the world tomorrow. And the trees of the field will yield their fruit, and the earth will yield her increase, and they will be safe in their land, and they shall know that I am the Eternal when I have broken the bands of their yoke and delivered them from the hand of those who enslaved them. And that all happened at the return of Christ, defeating the armies of the beast and all the world's other armies. And they shall no longer be a prey for the nations, nor shall the beasts of the land devour them, but they shall dwell safely, and no one will make them afraid. And I'll raise up for them a garden of renown, and they shall no longer be consumed with hunger in the land, nor bear the shame of the Gentiles any more. Thus they shall know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and they, the house of Israel, are my people, says the Lord God. So it's a wonderful prophecy that talks about a terrific environment that will take place. Let's go to Isaiah 41, just to whet our appetite on one other tidbit that comes along with this. Sometimes in the past, because we've been speculating about the world tomorrow for a long time. Feast of Tabernacles time especially, but lots of other times. You get into a world tomorrow discussion with brethren about as quick as you can any other topic, because it lifts us out of the mundane and the troubled times we live in today and gets us looking forward to the ideal society. This will be the best that man can be, will be during the millennial rule of Christ. And the great white throne judgment, of course, is kind of an extension in principle beyond that. Where did I say? Oh, chapter 41. That's right. Chapter 41. Here's another picture. It's like, now, just to envision this as a snapshot. You know how you go and you find somebody sends you a list of these old photos? Well, Amanda's been sorting through old photos from my side of the family. And so you study the picture and all the details in the background of it to see what kind of things they had and what they were doing and what did the place look like and all that sort of thing. Well, this is what we're doing with these pictures, these word pictures here. So we'll go from 17 to 20. The poor and the needy seek water, but there is none. The tongues fail for thirst. I, the Eternal, will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. Now, when you put this all together, you're looking there in verse 17, the time of what is called the second Exodus. This is right at the beginning of the millennium, when Israel is still scattered, and they've put them in slave camps and things like that, maybe around Europe, part of the Middle East, other places. and God releases them and brings them back to the land of Israel. Initially, they go there. Now, it's still going to be a way bigger population than ancient Israel ever had, but Israel will be expanded. You've got an awful lot of desert out there that can be expanded to become rich and fertile, and with all the rain in due season in particular. So God is bringing them back, and they're thirsty. And so he answers the problem. He says, I will open rivers in the desolate heights. Now, as I was saying, we've often talked about the millennial age as being flat ground because all the high places will be brought low and the low places are brought high and all the crooked places will be made straight. That's in Isaiah and several other places. Well, you have desolate heights. There are no heights in Kansas. I checked with Dorothy. Yeah, she verified that. Well, technically there are. There's a range of hills in Kansas, but they don't count. The rest of the place is a pancake. And most people don't like living on pancakes. Kansans do. They're used to it, I think. But in fact, in the world tomorrow, it won't all be flat. There will be hills and mountains, but they will be habitable and useful. We have really, really giant mountains. Some of them they're quite spectacular, but you can't live there. So if you have those mountains primarily, for the most part, adjusted to provide space for people to live, then you still have the heights and the lows. So he'll open rivers in the desolate heights. How does God open rivers in the desolate heights? Well, we don't have desolate heights in Ohio, so that's an unfair question. Go to the Rocky Mountains, you'll find out. Snow. It's snow. Snow is a vast reservoir of fresh water that God gives us every year. And it's a scary thing when it doesn't come. Believe me. Out west, if they talk about snowpack in the mountains, like we talk about rain coming down in August. Because snowpack is very, very important. That's a huge reservoir that will come down and keep the streams running and healthy and the rivers running and healthy and provide irrigation water in some cases. And just all kinds of benefits for the western states. So you'll open rivers in desolate heights, so you're going to have snow. That means it's not going to be 72 degrees and sunshine every day during the millennium everywhere. You'll have variety, the seasons. Rain has to come in due season. So there have to be seasons, you see. And fountains in the midst of the valleys, and I will make the wilderness a pool of water and dry land springs of water. So there'll be pools, there'll be surface water scattered about. Imagine the desert areas with pools and streams and rivers and lakes. It's going to be spectacular. And I will plant in the wilderness the cedar tree and the acacia tree, the myrtle and the oil tree, and I will set in the desert the cypress and the pine and the box elder, or box tree together. I don't know if it's box elder, but it's a box tree. That's called reforestation, planting of trees, and God says He will plant trees at that time. I don't know if we don't really have to. We're in Ohio. We don't plant trees. Trees plant themselves. They plant and they grow all by themselves. Doesn't work out quite that way out west. The loggers are, painted like ogres and demons themselves, according to the liberal side of politics out there. But the loggers have for decades been required to plant 7 trees for every one they cut down. They leave the forest behind them. It's a young forest, and it's growing, and then they log other areas, and eventually they circle back around, and that'll be logged by their grandkids. Well, reforestation, and if you study the environment at all, you'll understand the importance of that to fresh air, generation, of course, of oxygen, and sucking in of all the carbon monoxide. At least they got that right. We do need lots of trees, lots of plants. Actually, even with the spectacular forest, just to be clear, the thing that generates more oxygen in the world and eats more carbon monoxide or dioxide, grass. The grasslands. There's more plants. They generate more of the oxygen than even the trees. But the trees are vital. They hold the soil in the mountains. They provide the people. We won't be people then, and we aren't going to be, we'll be divine. We won't necessarily need to have houses to live in, because we won't get cold and we won't get hot. But the people will, and they'll need the trees for their various uses. So it's a spectacular, wonderful, beautiful prophecy. And a few pages earlier in chapter 35 and verse 1 is another one we love to read and think about. The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. And occasionally the deserts of the southwest of the United States, they'll get a big rain in May or so, and they'll explode into wildflowers. It's just a riot of color and gorgeous beauty for, a good couple of weeks. And then they start drying out, and pretty soon they are just dust in the wind. But the seeds are there for the next batch. No, but in the world tomorrow it will blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, and the excellence of Carmel and Sharon. Lebanon was where the cedars of Lebanon came from, and that's high, relatively high mountains. But it's great for growing forests. It still is. And the highest mountain is Mount Hermon, which is partly in the nation of Israel today and partly in Lebanon and partly in Syria. But Mount Hermon is 9,250 feet high. It's a high peak, snow-capped peak. That's why there's an Israeli ski team for the Winter Olympics. Carmel is, if you head sort of southwest from Mount Hermon, straight out toward the sea, you'll go right past Carmel. Mount Carmel is where Elijah had the showdown with the prophets of Baal, if you'll remember that event, which did not turn out well for the prophets of Baal, as you'll remember. But then Sharon, as they say it in Israel, Sharon rather than Sharon, means rose. That's the coastal plain that stretches from the south of Carmel, which is a terrific. The valley of Jezreel is the area of Carmel. Very, very prolific. Even today, phenomenal agricultural production area. The Israelis have 11 million people in a land area that's far smaller than ancient Israel was, and they produce more food by far than they can eat, and they export an awful lot of it. So Carmel is one of the primary areas they do that from. And Sharon, it's that coastal plain, rich. It gets plenty of rain water coming in from the Mediterranean. So you see the profit, the beauty of even what they have today is going to be magnified tremendously as the time to come. So it gives us a sense of the environment, just sort of orienting that. Let's look at the societal structure. What are the underpinning legislation or laws that will be governing the way society works? Now, I don't mean the Ten Commandments. That's above and beyond. And that deals with spiritual conditions and other things. Some of these will be, they're all extrapolated from the Ten Commandments, because that's the hierarchy of the law. You have the two great laws. You shall love God above all things and love your neighbor as yourself. And then you have the Ten Commandments. First four are loving God above all. The last six, loving your neighbor as yourself. And then all the rest of the laws that govern Israel and will therefore govern the world tomorrow descend from there. The principles of the Ten Commandments. But then they'll have their own listing, seemingly, as laws. So we'll start with number 1 in Leviticus 25. This is the law of divine ownership. And they get into an argument about whose land it is. You go back to the law. It belongs to God. Leviticus 25. Actually, we all come back and forth from Leviticus 25 a couple of times. To verse 23, and it's tied in with a couple of other key laws that we'll come back to. But verse 23 says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity," or permanently. "For the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the land of your possession you shall grant redemption of the land." So the land of Israel, any land that God gave the Israelites, any land that by extension God gave to anybody else. And then if there's any land left over, it's owned by God. He made this place. The land belongs to God. This is the law of divine ownership. And you stop to think about that. Doesn't he own us too? We walk around on the land. Whatever's on the land, he owns. We belong to God as well. The land, the earth, the universe belongs to God. We are just his sojourners or his settlers in that sense, humanly. And in the world tomorrow, that will be the case. But that will be understood. That is not understood. So we have the knockdown, drag-out, Hatfield and McCoy feuds that go on between nations and parts of nations. I mean, the Kurds in Syria and Iraq are having fights with each other right now, which isn't helpful because everybody's trying to exterminate them. They apparently are descendants from the ancient Elamites, or not Elamites, that's a different group. Some think they are actually residual leftovers of the Assyrians, but there was another tribe I heard speculated the other day in the news. But whatever the case, we have all kinds of wars taking place, popcorn of wars going on or preparing for. Russia's trying to get ready to take over the world. They're developing a massive underground bunker system so that the Russian government can survive and run the next war. And they're setting it up in the Ural Mountains, not far from Moscow. We have bunkers too, but this one is apparently, they speculate, is bigger than any that anybody else has ever had. And with China, everything seems to be calming down in the South China Sea, and then China starts pushing people around again. Never let it rest. Always shift, 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 move, 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 bully, bully, bully. And then North Korea, and those are such predictable people, they're getting ready to test their 5th nuclear device. And they have been busy building rockets. So the news headline today is that North Korea will soon have the capability of reaching Chicago with a nuclear weapon. Well, that's just jolly. We need God's government. We need to go to the feast to learn about it because it's constantly, every year, it prepares us more and more for how we'll be dealing with all that. All right, that's related to the fact, though, that there's divine ownership. There is also private ownership for humans. Obviously, humans don't own fundamentally. God owns fundamentally. We own what God allows us to own. So we can go to Micah 4 and verse 4 for this. Micah 4 and verse 4. First one of Micah gets a point. Phones don't count. Micah 4. I'm here. You probably anticipated this prophecy because it should get read at the feast every year, twice at least, maybe more. Verse 4, but everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For the people walk each in the name of his God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. The first part of verse 5, people walk in the name of his God. That won't be happening in the world tomorrow. That's what's happening now. And then the last part of the verse goes back to prophecy again. We will walk in God's way. But everybody sits under his own vine and his own fig tree. So individual humans own vines and fig trees. Of course, they're in big pots, and they have to drag them along in a little trolley behind them whenever they move. No, they're in the ground. Therefore, they own the ground. And then the houses are there. And you stop and think, well, how can you have a vine and fig tree if you live on the 13th floor of a 34-floor apartment complex or condominium place thingy? When the only space you have between you and the next tenants is a wall. Well, it's easy. You paint your vine and your fig tree on the wall. And then come autumn, when you want to eat a grape, you just scratch the paint off and eat it. Make sure that it's edible paint before you put it up there. That's as good as it's going to get. In the world tomorrow, there will be land around the homes. We won't all be jammed together, house added to house. That's condemned, by the way, in chapter 5 of Isaiah. adding field unto field and house to house. But that's what they've done. They made bigger and bigger fields because they have bigger and bigger tractors. And they try to turn them around. Why do they have such big tractors? Why did they? Well, because they want to own more land. See, agriculture has succumbed to the rat race. Whereas in the early 60s, we were largely a family farm industry. Agriculture has always been the biggest industry in America, and still is. When you all put together, not owned by one person, obviously, but it has been the biggest. But it was the family farms, and then they were starting to struggle in the mid-'60s, and they started the National Farmers Organization to try to get prices for their commodities to be a little bit higher so they could make a living and stay in business. But it didn't work out that way. And so those without a bankroll had to go out of business. Others bought, excuse me. I think there's a little coffee ground on my vocal cord. I don't know where that came from. But others would buy out the land, and they would add field into field until they had huger and huger land holdings. And then you think, well, yeah, well, at least the people still get to live out there on the farms. No, they don't. They move to town to find work. So they're off the farm. And you got the monster tractors driven by guys who also live in town, coming out to drive monster tractors. And, you don't have families on the soil anymore. And some say, well, yeah, well, what's wrong with that? Don't they have phones? They got the internet, don't they? Oh, yeah, it tastes great. Especially if it's a galaxy, whatever it was, that explodes. It's like popcorn, except really bad popcorn. The main product of agriculture is not food or money or monster tractors, it's people. The industry is designed to grow people who are steady, who have an understanding of the creation at a first-hand level on a daily basis, which gives them a steadiness and strength if they'll use it. But we have circumvented that system, so agriculture doesn't produce people because there aren't any people out there for it to produce in the course of the time of the past few decades only. Before that, they were still out there. So we do have the law of private ownership. There will be another law, though, that will be affected here. This is called the law of hard work. Now, it's not listed back here in the writings of Moses, but you'll find two references to the law of hard work. One is in Ecclesiastes, of all places. This wisdom book has a prophecy of the world tomorrow. Well, it isn't exactly a prophecy, but it's one of the principles of God's law. It is one of God's laws. Chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes and verse 10. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. So whatever you have to do while you're alive, do it. And do it well, best you can. Work hard. Enjoy what God's given you. Now, you think, yeah, well, that doesn't apply to the New Testament. That's just the old law that's been done away with. We don't have to work hard anymore. Nope, sorry. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Paul extrapolated from Ecclesiastes, as by God's inspiration, I think. I know that part, but I think he was extrapolating from Ecclesiastes and that principle right there. And we come down to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. See, before I read this, let me tell you the background. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 in particular, he talks in great detail about Christ's return, some of the timing and everything that was not known until then. And then John added to that later with the book of Revelation. So he wrote about that, and there were some unbalanced people. We're all unbalanced sometimes. In Thessalonica, they decided, wow, Christ is going to return soon. Cool. I'm going to quit my job. I hate that thing. So a whole bunch of people quit their jobs. And you think, well, what are they going to eat? Christ didn't come back. That's right. They just went over to other church members who didn't quit their jobs. They ate for their food. That's what they did. They freeloaded. Now, that doesn't sound right. Didn't even sound right in Jamestown, Virginia in 1509 either. Or 1609, sorry. So in chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, Paul takes them to task. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. Why would they have commanded it then? Because it was already a problem. There was a proclivity there. Lazy bones, sleeping in the sun. So he said, neither he that does not work will not eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you as in a disorderly manner, not working at all, and are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. So it was an adamant point. It is a law of hard work. Now, agricultural-based society introduces more people, a higher percentage of the people, to good hard work. That's certainly an advantage of it. Let's go to another element of the economy, the greater economy of the world tomorrow. Just weights and measures, the law of just weights. And that doesn't mean just weight, Henry Higgins. Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy 25, and we're going to be looking about verse 13. Begin. Here we go. Verse 13, you shall have in your bag, you shall not have in your bag, this is your business bag, differing weights, a heavy and a light. And you shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure, that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who behave unrighteously, are an abomination to the Lord God. Now, to put it in applicable terms for us today, suppose you go to the supermarket and you're going to buy 2 pounds of apples. And the checkout person has a button they're required to push with their foot. We don't see it. And so you have up there what you thought were about 2 pounds, and lo and behold, it says it's 3 pounds, and you pay the dollars for 3 pounds when you are only getting 2. You know, or if they were buying from a supplier and they bringing in 300 pounds of apples, they push another button when they're weighing it, and instead of weighing actually 300, why, that only weighs 200. Here's your money. In other words, differing weights. America outlawed that. That's why it's an anomaly to us. It doesn't happen. Well, it does, actually. And then we had to pass truth in advertising. See, advertising used to make ridiculous claims, and now you have to have truth in advertising, unless you're the government, probably, and a few others who seem to get away with it. But truth in advertising comes under the same category. They're advertising one thing, and you think you go and pay the money to get it, and they give you something else that isn't worth anywhere near that much. So this will be, the world tomorrow, everything is square. Just weights and measures. Nobody gets to double deal or to short sale or anything like that. Everything has to be fair and balanced. Okay, let's look next at another law. This is the law of tithes and offerings. So we already know about the law of tithing for the first tithe, you know, and the challenge back in Malachi. Let's look at that in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10. The challenge, God gave us a challenge as far as, and for many this was very enlightening for some of you, even when you came into God's church, that you saw this happen. Bring all the tithes, verse 10, all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out upon you such a blessing as that there will not be room enough to receive it. You pay me the tithe that I claim of all, because God owns everything that we have. Don't forget, He owns the soil and the planet we walk on, the whole planet. And he owns everything else, therefore, that we have, but he lets us sub-own it, but we have to pay the 10% to him, as in honor to God. Now, in ancient Israel, it had a specific use. That 10% of the gross production product of the Israelites, that 10% took care of the tribe of Levi. They had no inheritance. They didn't have a land holding like all the other tribes. So the tribe of Levi was paid the tithe. That provided for the nation, it provided the religious service, because that took care of the priests, but the Levites weren't all priests. Only the descendants of Aaron were priests. And it took care of the educational systems, because they would be involved in education. Churches sponsor education, always have. And that was the way it was in ancient Israel as well. The prophets many of the prophets were actually either priests or Levites. Not every one, but many of them were. Jeremiah was, Isaiah was, Ezekiel was. They're the three big ones. So the religious education is the fundamental education, but it can go to include other education as well, and various other services that the Levites provided for the nation. And that's where God didn't need the tithe. But he said it goes to the Levites. Now in the New Testament, it goes to the ministry of Jesus Christ to do his work, for them, to make a living and have food to eat and such. But it primarily goes as well then for the preaching of the gospel. So it is the law of tithes and offerings. Then we go to Deuteronomy 14. That was the first tithe that we're reading about back in Malachi. In Deuteronomy, we want to read about the second and the third tithe. And these will be active and done in the world tomorrow. Verse 22, you shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that's in the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and of your new wine and your oil and the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So the second tithe is designed to bring everybody to the Feasts of Tabernacles and the other annual holy days, to provide for their travel and their sustenance while they were there, learning to worship God and constantly being closer to him. And to be part of the greater society or economy of Israel as it was following God, or the economy of all the nations. All the nations will have to be grafted into Israel in the course of time, not because the Israelites were so great, just because God happened to choose them. They weren't so great. They lived up to a bad reputation many times. So that's the festival tithe, and we save that so we can go to the Feast of Tabernacles. Primarily, but some of it is used for the other holy days, for lunches and things like that. Verse 28, we have, every third year you shall bring the tithe of your produce of that year and store it within your gates, and the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance in you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may eat of it and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you with all the work of your hand which you do. So the third tithe was used to provide the welfare programs for the country. For there were always the poor among us, as Christ said. You will always have the poor among you. There will be some who have that need. And so in Israel, that was how it was set up. And when they obeyed it, it was a good thing. They didn't obey it very often. But in the world tomorrow, it will be a fundamental element of society, fundamental aspect of the economy. And it will work as it should work properly. Now, there's another law, though, that comes into play here. We've covered just weights, hard work, private ownership, and enterprise. Now, let's go back. This is related more to the private ownership. This is the law of land inheritance. We find this written about in Numbers 26. Count off the numbers and find 26, and that's where it is. Numbers 26. In verse 52, so it's a long chapter, so it's toward the 3/4 of the way in. The Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, to these the land shall be divided as an inheritance according to the number of the names. To a large tribe you shall give a larger inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a smaller inheritance. Each shall be given its inheritance according to those who are numbered of them. So remember the book of Numbers, you know what it was all about? Numbering the Israelites. That's what it was all about. That's why it's called Numbers. And this chapter lists the tribes and the numbers of the tribe, and then the inheritance laws were then based on that. So the up and the down of it is that as Moses brought them up to the promised land and sent Joshua across the Jordan River, because Moses and Aaron didn't get to go across the Jordan River. They both died outside of the formal part of the promised land. But Joshua would then take them in, and they would survey the land, and they would divide it out as God guided them. He would be overseeing that process, divided the land according to the tribes. The little tribes got small parts of land. The big tribes got big parts of land. Benjamin, if you have in the back of your Bible, perhaps you do, a map that shows the 12 tribes in Israel. The period of the judges is sometimes what it would be called. You'll see where their territories were. And you'll see that some are bigger than others. And when you look at Benjamin compared to Judah, which takes in the whole southern end of the country, Benjamin was sometimes called Little Benjamin because it was a little tribe and it had a small inheritance. Now, they didn't feel bad about it. Part of the time, they had some issues, Benjamites did, but as you well have read in Genesis, or in Judges, they had Jerusalem. Jerusalem was in Benjamin. And when Jerusalem became the capital of the country, then Benjamin allied with Judah. They became essentially, an adjunct to the tribe of Judah. Judah was the big tribe, they were the little tribe. Therefore, the Jews were made up of the two tribes, Benjamin and Judah, with a lot of the Levites mixed in. But there were a lot of Levites mixed into the northern kingdom when it went in captivity as well. The large tribes, and you look at the tribal territories, you think, well, Judah had a lot of territory. What came close to Judah? Manasseh. Manasseh was so hulking big that they had a large section of the western part of Israel, west of the Jordan River, closer to the Mediterranean. And then they had even a much bigger piece on the other side of the Jordan River. That was the half-tribe. On the west side of the Jordan, the one close to the Mediterranean, that was called either West Manasseh, as my map is showing here, but it was normally referred to as Machir. And you think, who's Machir? Well, he was the son of Manasseh. Machir was the son of Manasseh. And then the half-tribe was called Gilead, the land of Gilead. And sometimes it encompassed even more than just Manasseh, depending on what the reference was about. And you think, well, why is it called Gilead? Well, because Machir also had only one son, but his name was Gilead. The tribe didn't get off to a rip-roaring start. You had 2 generations of one son. Gilead got down to business. He had 10 kids. He had 10 sons and a lot of daughters. So then the tribe started to grow. So the law of land inheritance. There will be land in the millennium similar to what had happened here into the promised land, because in a sense the whole world kind of becomes the promised land, doesn't it? That God will allot land for all the nations. All the nations of Israel, descended from Israel, and all the Gentile nations. They'll have land inheritance. So land inheritance will be a law. That land is your families and your clans or your nations, your tribes' land, and you cannot sell it in perpetuity. You can sell it for a period of time. But in the 50th year, which is the Jubilee year, the land comes back to the family. And we'll come to that because that's the law of the Jubilee year. So we have land inheritance as a fundamental law in the world tomorrow. We have the land Sabbath. We'll go now to Leviticus 25 again. We were there before, so I know we know the way. Right at the beginning of the chapter, and the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, The land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. The land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. So there is a land Sabbath every 7th year. It was a mirror image on a larger scale of the week. You had 6 days you'll labor, and then the Sabbath you'll rest. 6 years your land will labor, and this land Sabbath, the land rests. It doesn't get cultivated. It doesn't get planted. It just rests. Now, you think, well, so what do we do then? Well, think of the time that will not be needed for planting and harvesting, and you think, what would the people do? Well, that's a perfect time for furthering their education, fundamentally in understanding God's way, but other elements of education as well. For adults, refresher time. Secondarily, it's a marvelous time. You have a huge pool of people for public works. The building of municipal buildings, or the repair thereof, the building of roads and other kinds of things that need to be done, that would be the perfect time to do it. In the 7th year, when they have very little to do as far as their main cropping goes for those who are involved directly in agriculture. Now let's read some of the details of the land Sabbath. We're doing a survey, and we could do a whole sermon on it. It would be quite fascinating. You shall neither, where was I? Verse 5. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap. There's always grain or whatever your crop's been. There's going to be some seeds that fell to the ground, and they'll come up volunteer after that. So you're not going to go out with your scythe and reap it, or your combine and reap it. You're just going to leave it there. Nor are you going to gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land, let me see, I skipped over something here. Oh, yeah. Nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, so you got grapes on the vine, let the birds eat them, and the foxes. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you. In other words, you can eat it as it comes in season. You want strawberries, fine. Get some strawberries and eat them. But you can't freeze them, or you can't dehydrate them, or you can't can them. Same with any of the other vegetables and fruits. You can eat them when they're fresh in season, just like the birds and the critters are doing. But you can't store them. And of course, you say, well, what are we going to eat then? Of course, that's not what we're going to read you. It's further down the line there. But if you're going to keep the land Sabbath faithfully, then in the 6th year, you get a double harvest, which is part of the reason why you'll be thankful for a land Sabbath, because you'll be working like a dog. A working dog. Not all dogs work. You'll be working like a dog to get all of that harvest in. A double harvest is going to overload everything. But you'll be ready for it. The people will be ready for it. I mean, we know ahead of time this is going to happen, so we can teach them that. And remember, we're part of overseeing this economy and this society. And also, it's not just you can eat it as it comes in season, but your servants can eat it, your hired man or the stranger who dwells with you, if you got company there, or your livestock. If your cattle take a liking to grapes, let them eat them. I don't think they will, but there will be a few. They like apples, though. And the beasts of the field, the beasts that are in your land, is all produce. All the produce will be for food for them. So they hold it. We used to have pheasants in Ohio. Chinese ringneck pheasants, non-native species. Can't really say they're an invasive species because we brought them over, but they're gone. They're gone with the tractors. The bigger the tractor, the fewer the pheasants. Because the big tractors they don't pay attention when they turn around and their implements tear out the fence. A whole long line of fence for half a mile, and all the grass that grew along the fence line where the pheasants had their nests, that's all gone too. And they can't nest in the food that they're growing because they keep coming through with those big balloon-tired monstrosity things, spraying poisons on everything. That would kill the hens, or the chicks at least. So we don't have livestock or wildlife like that. In the world tomorrow, you will have a lot of wildlife. Every 7th year, the wildlife is going to get a huge boost. So people will have plenty of pheasant under glass. or pheasant under cast iron, depending on how crunchy you want the outside of the bird to be. But they'll be able to enjoy and savor the beauty of that. That's the law of the land Sabbath. And with the law of the land Sabbath, although we have to come back here, you might just turn your page over to chapter 15 of Deuteronomy. There's another law that's connected directly to it. It happens at the same time. At the end of every 7 years, this is verse 1 of chapter 15 of Deuteronomy, at the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it, and he shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner you may require it, but you shall not give up your claim to that which is owed. You shall give up your claim to that which is owed by your brother. You think, why can they loan money to people who aren't Israelites and they still get it back? You know, they still have to pay it back. I think that probably will have a lot to do with the Israelite or the Gentile nations wanting to become attached to Israel, to where they embrace the true God, which is truly the God of Israel, but far better understanding than the Israelites ever had of it. But when they convert to, come to repentance and convert, then in a sense it probably are going to be classified as Israelites, and then the law will apply to them there. This would be a motivation for them as a group to want to do that. And it will always have this, except when there are no poor among you. For the Lord will greatly bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess an inheritance, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God and take care of all these commandments. So we have the land Sabbath and the year of release happening at the same time. And then there's the next thing that comes from that, and that's the law of the Jubilee year. And back in Leviticus 25, we read about the Jubilee year. It's in verse 8. It's where it begins of chapter 25. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years to yourself, 7 times 7 years, and the time of 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Very clear, it's 49 years. And you shall then cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. It's kind of interesting. In the Hebrew calendar, you have more than one new year. You have the primary new year, where the months start over again, in the spring. And then the Jews have always had the Feast of Trumpets as a civil new year, make a business year. But the agricultural new year is the Day of Atonement. And you think, wow, why is that the agricultural new year? Well, because farming next year always gets started as soon as you finished harvesting this year. Then you plan. Next year is immediately the next thing you got to do is plan for the coming year. So it is, in a sense, it is actually the beginning of the agricultural year. You've got equipment to prepare, the seed to look after, and the storage of it, and all of those things. So it starts on the Day of Atonement. You'll make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land, and consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty to the land to all its inhabitants, and it will be a jubilee for you. And you shall return to his possession. So this is where the Jubilee law ties back into the land inheritance laws. And each of you return to his family. That 50th year will be a jubilee. You will neither sow nor reap that which grows of its own accord, and gather in the grapes of your untended vine. Now that's an interesting one. The end of every 50th year, or every 50 years, you have 2 land Sabbaths back to back. Because the Jubilee is also a land Sabbath, and the 49th year, divisible by 7, so it's the 7th year, is also a land Sabbath. So you have a double land Sabbath year sequence there. Now, we've never lived through that, because this law doesn't get applied in our world today. There are going to be some very interesting aspects of what will you do when you have a double land Sabbath, which will happen twice every century. There's got to be some significant civic events that take place then, maybe even deeper education and such, that we have to contemplate. When you begin to see the structure, then you can try to reason, okay, what is God wanting to be done then? So, but you can using these basic laws we're talking about as a structure, it gives you a world of things to meditate on or reflect upon and speculate on and savor the beauty of God's way and the planning that He has. But in the 50th year, that land inheritance, you can sell your land, but not in perpetuity. That's a fancy-dancy real estate term that means forever. You can sell it only until the next Jubilee. So technically, you're leasing the land for however many years it is. Till the Jubilee. Then it comes back to your family. It may not come back to you if you're old and you've died and your grandkids have it maybe. But, you know, that'll be the natural rotation of things as time goes by. But it comes back. Well, what's the value of having a big chunk of land coming back into the family? Economic opportunity. It redistributes the wealth. We do it by disobeying God's laws and ignoring these as far as the structure of our lands. The only thing that we come close to is we use the principle of the year of release. The seventh year is releasing consumer debt. We use that principle to establish bankruptcy laws, which are a real poor substitute for what God has here. But at least they are an attempt. You know, you give them credit for that. But what will it be like when all of these are put into motion and put into play? Again, it's fascinating to see how it will work together. The Jubilee and the land Sabbath and the year of release. But you have that 50th year coming, and you have the educational potentials that are there, the economic opportunity of the land coming back to the family. As I said, what we do today, instead of the Jubilee year, we just have economic depressions, like in the 30s and in the 1880s. And, you know, about 50 years later, you know, we have economic depression. Sometimes they can schmooze them along to where they don't completely collapse, but not always. The 30s, they couldn't do that at all, and it collapsed. A massive depression. That's how that's how wealth was redistributed. Inefficiently, because the rich got richer and the poor got way poorer. But not under God's way. It's economic opportunity every 50th year. There are several other laws of a similar nature that I think can give us a lot to think about. There's the law of no usury, for example. We could look at that just for a second. In Leviticus 25. It's right here in 25, verses 35 to 38, covered also in Deuteronomy. Why, if it's in Leviticus, would it also be in Deuteronomy? It's because Deuteronomy means second reading of the law, or the second writing of the law. It's a summary of the laws. So you'll end up with, it echoes and adds a few details sometimes. Where was I? I'm talking and not counting. 39. And if one of your brethren who dwells among you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave, but as a hired servant and sojourner he shall be with you. An indentured servant. And indentured servanthood isn't a bad thing, provided it's done correctly. America was settled by indentured servants, a great many of them. The Irish and the Scots-Irish, poor, who from England and Ireland, who couldn't afford to come over here themselves back in colonial days, but would then hire themselves or indenture themselves to somebody wealthy who was coming to the colonies, and then they would work for them for 5 or 7 or 10 years, and they would have their economic freedom, and off they would go, and they would go and pioneer their own land after that. And as a hired servant and a sojourner he shall be with you, and you shall serve you till the year of the Jubilee, and then he'll depart from you, he and his family, and back to his own possession. And so we have, there are other ramifications of that aspect of it. In Deuteronomy, I wanted to read in verse, 23, chapter 23 of Deuteronomy. Just a little bit more, verses 19 and 20 of chapter 23. Yes, this is the one I wanted. You shall not charge interest to your brother. Interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. So if it's an Israelite, Israelites couldn't charge him interest. To a foreigner, you may charge interest. But to your brother, you shall not charge interest. that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you do in all your land and the land you are entering to possess. And you think, okay, so foreigners get charged interest, but a fellow Israelite doesn't. Then what if a foreigner wants to be classified as an Israelite? You know, and he becomes in ancient Israel, became an Israelite, like Ruth, for example. Well, then they wouldn't be charged either. They would be counted as an Israelite. So that there was an advantage of being allied and being a part of Israel. You can see how, on a national scale, that could have some very positive influences in the age to come, as we're working with all the nations, teaching them God's way. And remember, we're not going to be living as people then. We're going to be living as God's resurrected children, helping to govern under Jesus Christ. What we have then is a marvelous picture of an economy and a structure of society that provides freedom of opportunity in so many ways. There's a passage to end our sermon. It's a summary that Christ gave of his ministry. Now, Christ's ministry, it's in, by the way, Luke 4, so let's turn to Luke 4. Christ's ministry was all about freedom and all about opportunity. Primarily freedom from sin and the opportunity to live forever in the kingdom of God. But the ramifications of it diffused further down into the regular society of people and the regular economy of mankind. Chapter 4 of Luke, and let's see. Here we go. We begin in verse 16, the introduction to what he read. He came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath. Christ kept the Sabbath. And he stood up to read. He was a young man, a responsible member of the community, and so he took his turn in the readings. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, except it would have been a scroll. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. So I don't know if that meant that it opened right up to the spot or if he rolled it back and forth, rolling the vellum from one roller to the next till he found the spot. It doesn't specify that. Could have been either. But he found the spot. I think that he did a little rolling just to create a little suspense there. And then he looked up and he said, "The Spirit of the Eternal is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Most of this is taken out of Isaiah 61. Isaiah was echoing the principles of the Jubilee year, the year of release, and the principles that built the land Sabbath and all the other superstructure of the human society and human economy under God's government in the world tomorrow. To set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim liberty to the captives. You know, that will literally be fulfilled, but it's in the principle of the Jubilee. So as we go to the feast, we're going to be hearing a lot of prophecies about the world tomorrow, hopefully a lot of them. But you go maybe armed with a few thoughts on your own. I always find it's nice when you get back to your room or maybe a condo or motel room or wherever you're staying, hotel room. If you have some things already made to meditate on and think about it, what it will be like in the world tomorrow, the more we savor that incredible time of God's kingdom ruling the earth, the more we'll value it in our lives today and in the world tomorrow itself.